The morning it happened, the sun was already high. I remember that because I had been awake since before it rose, sitting on the edge of my bed in the dark, rehearsing the words I was about to say. I had written them out the night before on a small piece of paper, then folded it, then unfolded it, then folded it again. I never brought it with me. I didn't need to. The question had been living inside my chest for 3 years by then, pressing against my ribs every Sunday, every sermon, every silent meal where nobody said what they were actually thinking. I was 19 years old, and that morning, I asked it out loud. By the following week, no one in my community would speak my name. Before I go any further, my name is Hannah, and this is Hannah the Amish girl. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, and this channel is where I finally say the things my community would never allow me to say out loud. The stories behind the prayer cap. The truths that were never supposed to leave the community. If you want to hear more of what life inside that world actually looked like, not the tourist version, not the postcard, then subscribe to this channel, like this video, and turn on your notification bell so you never miss a story. Because I have so many more truths waiting. And now, let me tell you what I asked. In Old Order Amish life, the church service is everything. It happens every other Sunday, rotating between homes in the district. No building, no pews, no microphone. Just backless wooden benches carried from farm to farm in a wooden wagon, set up in someone's living room or barn, and filled before 7 in the morning. The men on one side, the women on the other, children pressed between mothers and grandmothers, babies passed silently when they fuss. The service lasts 3 hours, sometimes more. 2 sermons, both in High German, a language most of the children do not actually speak. You sit with your hands folded. You do not shift. You do not whisper. You do not question. That last part was the one I could never quite manage. I had been baptized at 17. That is the moment in Amish life that seals everything. Before baptism, during the Rumspringa years, a young person has a kind of theoretical freedom. The community knows you haven't yet chosen, so your doubts are quietly tolerated. But once you kneel before the bishop and accept the faith, the ordnung, the community, but you have made a vow before God and before every person sitting on those benches. To leave after baptism is not just a personal choice, it is a betrayal. And to question, publicly, what you have vowed to uphold, that is something close to unthinkable. I had been thinking it for 3 years. The question began the winter I was 16. A girl in our district, I will call her Ruth, had her baby taken. That is not the phrase they used, but that is what happened. She was 17, unmarried, and the deacon and the bishop met with her family and decided the baby would be raised by her aunt and uncle, a couple who had not been able to have children of their own. Ruth was told this was God's will. She was told she was too young, too fallen, too much of a burden on her family to raise a child she had not been meant to have. She was given 2 days to say goodbye. I watched Ruth at the next church service. She sat in her usual place, 3rd bench from the front, hands folded. She did not cry. Her face looked like a window with the curtain drawn, like something had been pulled shut behind her eyes, and the latch locked from the inside. I sat 4 benches behind her, and I thought, for the first time clearly, who decided that? Not just who decided it about Ruth, but who decided any of it? Who decided what God's will looked like when it was handed down through a deacon in a kitchen on a Tuesday? Who decided that her silence was faithfulness, and her grief was something to be managed rather than heard? I carried that question like a stone in my apron pocket for 3 years. Now, that here is what you need to understand about asking questions in an Old Order Amish community. There is a shape that questions are allowed to take. They can be humble. They can be directed downward, toward your own unworthiness, your own failure to understand, your own need for more faith. What they cannot be is directed outward, toward the structure, toward the leadership, toward the way decisions are made and by whom and for whom. That kind of question is not called curiosity, it is called Hochmut, pride. And in my community, pride was not a flaw to be corrected. It was a contamination to be contained. I knew this. I had known it since I was small enough to sit on my mother's lap during service and feel her hand press firm against my knee when I fidgeted. The message was always the same, and it never needed to be spoken. Stay still. Stay quiet. Stay inside the shape of what is allowed. For 3 years, I stayed inside the shape. And then, one Sunday morning in October, a week after my 19th birthday, I did not. If you have stayed with me this far, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and turn on your notification bell. I share these stories because they deserve to be heard, and this one changed the entire direction of my life. Keep watching. The bishop had been preaching on Gelassenheit, yielding. It was one of the central sermons of the Amish faith, the one I had heard in some form every year of my life. Yield your will, yield your preferences, yield your understanding to the understanding of the community, of the scripture, of God. The bishop was a tall man with a gray beard that reached the second button of his coat, and when he spoke, the room was so quiet you could hear the horses outside shifting their weight. He was speaking about Ruth, not by name. They never used names in sermons. It was considered a kind of mercy. But everyone in that room knew who he meant. He was speaking about a young woman who had stumbled and been caught by the community before she could fall further. He used the word redemption. He used the word protection. He said the community had acted in love. And I heard my own voice before I had decided to use it. I said, "Who asked her?" Just that. 3 words. Spoken at a volume that was somehow too loud for the room, too loud for the silence, too loud for 19 years of being told to keep my shape. I said it the way you say something when the question has been waiting so long it simply steps out of you on its own, without permission. The silence that followed was not like the silence of the service. The service silence was soft, full, held together by devotion. This silence was hard. It had edges. I felt every person on the women's side turn their eyes toward me without moving their heads. I felt my mother's hand find my knee, not gently the way she had when I was small, firmly, the way you grip something that is about to fall. The bishop looked at me for a long moment. His expression did not change. He said very quietly that we would speak after the service, and then he continued his sermon as though I had not spoken at all. What happened after the service happened slowly, the way a door closing in a large house can be heard room by room. First the bishop, then my father called in from the yard, and his face carefully still in the way men's faces go still when they are deciding something and do not want you to see them deciding. Then the deacon. Then 2 of the older women of the church who sat on a bench across from me in a room that smelled like cold wood and coffee, and said nothing but looked at me the way you look at a thing that has broken, and you are trying to determine whether it can be repaired. They asked me if I was sorry. I said I was sorry for the disruption. They asked me if I repented of my pride. I sat with that word for a moment, repented, pride, and I said that I didn't understand how asking a question was pride. That was the wrong answer. Not because of what I said, but because of the fact that I had said it. A woman who truly repented would not have parsed the question. She would have simply bent. I did not bend. The formal shunning, the Meidung, took another 2 weeks to be declared. Those 2 weeks were their own kind of education. I still lived in my parents' house. I still sat at the table for meals. But the texture of everything changed. My mother spoke to me in the minimum number of words a situation required. My younger sisters were careful around me in the way children are careful around something they have been told, without being told, is dangerous. My father did not look at me directly. It was not cruelty. I want to be clear about that, because I have had years of therapy to get clear about it, and the clarity matters. It was not cruelty. It was fear. The shunning was not only about me, it was a message to every other person in that community about what happens when you use your voice in the wrong direction. I was the message. When the Meidung was declared, it was read in a service I attended. They do it that way. You sit there and you hear the community formally withdraw from you. Baptized members are not to eat at the same table with a shunned person, not to accept anything from their hand, not to do business with them. The isolation is total and it is communal. It belongs to everyone, not just to the person being shunned. The whole community participates in it. And in that participation, they are reinforced. Their loyalty is demonstrated. Their belonging is confirmed. I sat on that bench and I listened and I thought about Ruth. About the way her face had looked with the latch locked from the inside. And I understood, for the first time, not just what had happened to her, but why she had let it happen without a sound. Because she already knew what sound cost. I want to be honest with you about what came next, because this is the part that people outside closed religious communities often find hardest to understand. I did not leave immediately. I stayed for another 8 months. I stayed because the shunning was complete, and the shunning was mine, and it sat on me like weather. You cannot argue with weather, you can only try to find shelter inside it. I stayed because my mother was there, because the barn smelled like the barn had always smelled, because leaving meant that every version of myself that had existed before that Sunday morning in October was also leaving, and I did not yet know who would be on the other side. I stayed because even when a place has hurt you, it is still the only place you have ever known how to be. I left 2 days after my 20th birthday. I took a single bag. I did not tell anyone I was going. Not because I was afraid of them stopping me, but because I could not bear the particular silence of a goodbye that no one is allowed to give you. My mother was in the kitchen when I walked through it for the last time. She had her back to me. I stood in the doorway for a moment. She did not turn around. I do not know if she knew I was there. I like to think she knew. In therapy, in the months and then years that followed, I learned words I had never once heard spoken inside that community. Coercion, institutional control. The difference between a faith that asks for your surrender and a system that requires it because it cannot survive your questions. My therapist said something that I have returned to so many times it has worn smooth like a river stone. She said, "A community that cannot hold your questions does not actually trust its own answers." I had never thought of it that way. I had always understood my questioning as the problem, the thing that was broken in me, the pride, the Hochmut, the failure to yield. But she was naming something different. She was saying that the fragility was not mine. The question, who asked her, was not dangerous because it was wrong. It was dangerous because the system had no answer it could afford to give. 3 words, and they could not hold them. The Amish world gave me things I carry still. A capacity for silence that I now choose rather than perform. A knowledge of how to work until the work is done. A memory of community so textured and close that every version of belonging I have found since lives a little in its shadow. These things are real, and I do not set them down. But there is no faith I recognize, no God I have found in the years since, that asks a 19-year-old girl to watch another girl's child be taken and to say nothing. To sit on a wooden bench and let the question die inside her chest, rather than risk the shape of her silence. Gelassenheit was supposed to mean yielding to God. What it meant in practice, too often, was yielding to the men who spoke in God's name and could not be asked to account for the difference. Ruth moved away 3 years after I left. I heard this from someone who had left before me. I do not know where she went or whether she ever found her child. I hope she found language for what was done to her. I hope someone somewhere asked on her behalf. Who asked her? If you grew up somewhere that called your silence holy, I see you. If you were told that your questions were pride, that your voice was danger, that love looked like disappearing into what the community needed you to be, I see you. You were not broken. You were asking the right question in a room that could not survive the answer. If this story moved something in you, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. I have so many more truths to share. Stories that were never supposed to leave. and every single one of them deserves to be heard. Until next time, choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.